Hi, this is Paul. I want to do a little video on, well, lately a lot of my videos have been following what I've been following on Twitter. And I don't know who this person is, Bo Weingard, but he's had a bunch of interesting tweets lately, and other people who follow me on Twitter always tag me in tweets that they think I would find interesting, and they're almost always right. He tweets this: a person once scolded me for something like, "How dare you use data and arguments to challenge the lived experience of minorities?" Isn't that the point of all science and philosophy? To transcend our limited and biased experiences with data and arguments? From what I can tell, lived experience is a moral, elevated way to say, you must believe what I'm saying even though I don't have any data or theory behind because I want you to. It's exactly the opposite of what we usually try to argue. I don't think lived experience is completely irrelevant. A person with a disability might understand something about the world that I don't. But in an argument, it's no better than the anecdote. Its evidentiary value is virtually zero. And all very good points. I've been thinking a lot recently about the question of statistics and data with respect to reality. Lived experience has become a claim of privileged epistemology. If I experience oppression, you must accept it. It's not even an argument, it's simply an assertion, and assertions you will either take or leave. But of course, assertions with a degree of public, assertions with a fair degree of public pressure behind them, that's what we're dealing with now, quite obviously. And part of the difficulty is that someone's claim of oppression or suffering or injustice, these are terribly difficult to evaluate for a very long, we've had the question of white people's problems for a while now, okay? Or first world problems or things like this where someone is freaking out and everybody else looks at them and kind of shrugs and says, I don't value your suffering, or your suffering does not merit me going out of my way in order to somehow accommodate you or give in to you or whatnot. And so a big part of the back and forth over critical theory and a bunch of these things has to do with trying to gain some sort of public communal agreement with respect to values and suffering and what requires public sacrifice and the expense of public goods or even public attention for what cause or another. I noted that I live in Sacramento, California, and there's almost always some protest on the steps of the Capitol here in Sacramento. And all sorts of people have all sorts of claims at oppression and injustice, and they're on the steps of the Capitol making their claims heard. And these claims come and go. Just recently we had enormous protests with respect to George Floyd, police brutality, systemic racism, etc. Everybody at some point goes home, and these things just sort of evaporate out into the world. And these value systems, of course, have to line up in hierarchies, and whenever we act, we express a hierarchy. I mean, this is Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Peugeot basics here. And so sussing out how these things work and how we're supposed to evaluate them is always a difficult thing. And it very quickly gets into the area of consciousness, because data is an attempt sometimes with respect to psychology or sociology to sort of gain a larger picture of multiple consciousnesses, a collective conscious. There's actually a lot going on in these conversations that we pretty ably just sort of run through, but if you pause and think about them, they get pretty squirrely pretty quickly. If your claims are about a conscious experience or feeling, it gets very vague indeed. And I remember C.S. Lewis making a comment about suffering. So you've got the suffering of this person and the suffering of that person. You don't just add these sufferings together and say, here's a suffering number, here's a suffering quotient. I mean, this is part of what we're struggling with, because you can't really quantify suffering. Because Peter Kreeft in The Dark Side, which is a very interesting talk he gave at Eric Metaxas's Socrates in the City. You can find it in various forms on the internet. There's so many different kinds of suffering that we have to deal with. Physical pain is one kind, but so often a degree of psychic suffering is so much more. People, again, suicide rates have climbed for nearly every segment except African American men. I picked that up from Tim Keller's preaching book. And I think that is an expression probably of the fact that African American men have had such low expectations of what to expect in society that they sort of shrug. But you have a lot of middle-class white men for whom they've gotten what was supposed to be the pinnacle of their career within a certain imaginary, and it hasn't reached expectations, and so they take their own lives. And so these claims about conscious experience and feelings and suffering, there's no way to sort of quantify these things or put them in numbers. And this is especially challenging because so much in our public conversation is distilled into numbers, and these become justification for public policy, for lawsuits, on and on you go. When we get to the meaning crisis, John Vervaeke, Christopher Maestro Pietro talk about, you're working on very vague areas, and maybe you can note a rise in suicide, or a rise in opiate addiction, or a rise in consumption of alcohol, or a rise in school dropouts, or a rise in domestic violence. So we look at a bunch of these other numbers in order to try and get a sense of what is the communal lived experience for the people around us. And if we sense that things are getting worse, that's about as low resolution and estimation as you can find, but we're pretty simple creatures, and so we like boiling things down into binaries, and politicians, of course, measure better, track where the nation is getting better, the nation is getting worse, and you do all these things, and you survey all of these people, and they say yes or no, and this then is supposed to and probably will guide politicians in terms of what they're talking about with respect to election. There's no way that all of this data that we use is somehow powerless or insignificant, but the nexus between it and lived experience, something we should give considerable more thought to. Because, as always, whatever your lived experience, others around you are going to be evaluating it according to the measures that they have. Is your emotional state justified? Again, if you listen to someone like Glenn Lowry or John McWhorter, it seems inconceivable that someone would seriously argue that, and again, just look how fudgy all of this is, that the lives of African Americans today are worse off than they were for African Americans in the Jim Crow South or during slavery. It seems just a wholly preposterous idea, and we would say that for all sorts of reasons, but we have great difficulty in actually measuring this, because again, the decline in life expectancy, again, this is all data, and the rise in suicide of white males who are supposed to be imagined at the top of the heap. Well, is that a differential between the fact that they aren't doing so well in their own estimation, and to what degree or another is that a comparison between how they see their lives versus their expectations of what their life would be? And where have those expectations been molded and shaped? They've been molded and shaped by, in many ways, the consumerist marketplace that has people older than me in great shape with beautiful heads of hair managing 6 or 7 figures of savings in the bank. Many of the white people I deal with are on basic Social Security, living paycheck to paycheck. dealing with some kind of chronic illness may be pain, and golden years, they don't spend their times on golf courses. They spend their times in doctors' waiting rooms. And these are the people who are on Medicare. And so, data versus lived experience. Wow. What a difficult conversation to figure out. But again, lately I've been pondering how fudgy all of this really is, because so much of the evaluation we do is evaluated against what? What other pictures? The people we see on TV who are wealthier, better looking, healthier, etc., etc. Or we compare ourselves to others in our neighborhood. And again, these are all enormously biased measurements. And so, yeah, this is a good conversation and an important one to have. One of the things, so I've been, the Weinsteins have now become, front and center IDW people in many ways. With Jordan's absence, Eric and Brett now both with two large, successful podcasts, putting out a ton of material almost all the time, it seems. Well, they're pumping stuff out into the world. I would argue that a secular frame basically heightens the stakes and heightens the anxieties in many of these metrics for secularized people. At least suffering people of other world, of past ages, had other worlds to look forward to. And so when, as in the song of a sitcom from the 70s, when the world doesn't seem to be living up to your dreams. Because in many ways, those are the subjective lived experiences, evaluations that people are going to be acting out of. I think for many people, that's part of the reason Donald Trump got elected, because they saw Hillary and said, enough of that, and so let's try this guy. Probably the reason Donald Trump may not be elected a second time. People are very binary in these sort of things. So what I hear a lot from Brett, because he's a scientist and science is helpful. When you're a biologist and you're studying animals, you're looking at data sets and you're looking at the populations of sharks in the ocean, and you tag them, and you look at whales and their migratory patterns, and you do all of these things to try to assess enormously difficult things to assess. I have a niece who is currently getting a PhD studying lobsters. Okay? Isn't that ironic? So I have a niece who is getting a PhD studying lobsters. And what is she studying? Lobsters. She's living in Rhode Island, studying whether or not there are going to be lobsters in Narragansett Bay. Because, well, ocean temperatures are warming and lobsters are pretty finicky and they like things just so. And so she's doing this massive study, and she had all these tiny little lobsters, and, she's getting a PhD in marine biology, and she's using data sets. But when it comes to people, well, we treat people differently than we treat little baby lobsters. Using data sets to get a picture of reality. Exactly what picture? And again, so when we're talking about, and this is one of the things that I continue to mull over as I listen to Brett, when we're talking about science and we have this idea of metaphorical truth, well, I think in many ways, much of the science, although it's informed by data, is fundamentally pictorial and narrative, because again, that's pretty much our basic operating system. And because so many of our systems are democratic and built on influence, all of this science will one way or another get boiled down into a story. And one of the gifts that Brett actually has is of a storyteller. Brett is able to take selective data points of science and build it into a story that gives us a sense that we can relate to this thing out there we call reality. But when it comes to people, each individual is not a data set. They are a sample of one. And part of what secularity does, okay, in all fairness, secularity heightens the anxiety and the drama. Again, Miroslav Volf noted this in the Yugoslav Civil War. Many people who are fighting, they're communists and they're coming out of the communist Yugoslavia, and so they're not expecting that they will have another life. And so, well, better my enemy die and I get to have a shot at more happiness and realizing my dreams than me die. But again, so you only live once, I think, means fewer tolerances on risk for people. Eric Weinstein, in one of his podcasts, was asking the question, why are baby boomers so selfish? I think it's fairly easy to guess that, in all likelihood, baby boomer selfishness could be impacted by rising secularity. Older individuals had heaven or some other blessed afterlife to look forward to, meaning that in some ways they were less attached and less anxious about the clingy things of this life. I think in secularity, that gets displaced into projected ideas of humanity in the future. And so if you listen to Eric and Brett, they're very anxious about the future. They're very anxious about that, hoping everyone has, well, if you're living in a secular box, you have a fundamentally hedonist frame. What is the summum bonum? What is the greatest good? That our children and their children and their children have happy lives, that they have meaningful lives, that they live up to their potential. Now, what I found is that for science guys, when these guys actually get to the point of what is good, humanity must be preserved, as C.S. Lewis said in The Abolition of Man, they actually get very vague in terms of their goal. So Rebel Wisdom has just been putting out the content, and they've had two really meaty conversations, one with Brett and one with Eric, and I like the fact that David Fuller keeps on this IDW beat and keeps asking questions. I really appreciate that, and I thought both the conversation with Eric and the conversation with Brett were outstanding. But part of what really pricked up my ears in this conversation with Eric was the end, when we get down to application.
Of the initial constellation of people in the New York Times article, both your
New York Times article about the IDW,
yourself and Brett at that point didn't have podcasts. You didn't have your own kind of route to market in a way. You both do now. You say that you've both done pretty well out of that constellation, and now
they've done very well.
Kind of launch,
at least compared to me.
You're launching out on your own.
Oh, I wouldn't think about it in those terms. I would say that I want to measure. I mean, if the issue is listenership, yeah, listenership's been great. Okay,
now we're getting into evaluation here. We're getting into measuring. And so one of the things that you notice if you have a YouTube channel is they give you all these metrics, and you get hours watched and views and so on and so forth. But the longer I've been doing this, the more I realize those numbers tell you some things, but what do they really tell you? It's really very hard to figure out. Now, both Brett and Eric are, have far more YouTube listeners than I do, and I deservedly so. I think they're a lot smarter than I am, and they deserve to be listened to, and I listen to them. I enjoy listening to them. I'm happy they're in the conversation. But how do you evaluate this? What's your goal? Because of course, why have all these numbers and metrics if you don't have a goal? And if you're a sciencey person, you're going to want a goal with numbers. Back in the 80s and 90s, during the seeker wave in the churches, getting numeric goals was really hot in churches, and so pastors all read business books and got MBAs and tried to apply business things to their churches and try to improve those numbers and on and on. And I would say my opinion of that entire effort to try and get numbers on these things was, in the end, folks kind of walked away from it.
People are incredibly motivated, but I want to measure it in terms of actual changes in the culture.
Want to measure it in terms of actual changes in the culture. Well, how? Tell me how you're going to measure this.
And so to the extent that we have right now people who are working on various projects that nobody's even aware of that are occurring, we have a very active group of people who are discussing these issues 24/7 using, let's say, a Discord server for voice chats.
So his Discord server is going well, and I lurk on his Discord server sometimes, and every now and then I pop into the voice chat. Now, for me, going on to Bridges of Meaning Discord server is sort of like walking into my church, because there's so much religious talk on Bridges of Meaning, and that's, as I've mentioned in previous podcasts, that's often a problem. It's kind of fun to go into the Portal Discord server and go in a chat room, and usually one or two people will recognize me, and I like to ask a lot of questions, and okay, what kinds of things are they talking about? And I usually like to ask them a lot of. Anybody who watches my channel knows I'm nosy. You know, I got this big nose, and I know how to use it, because I'm curious about people, and I want to know what they care about, what makes what makes them tick. And now again, I'm not keeping track and keeping numbers. Maybe I would know more if I did, but it's like kind of goes into my imaginary, and I try and get a picture of, okay, who is listening to Eric, and what are they getting out of it, and why do they listen to Eric, and what do they think he's doing, and how does he think he's helping? And again, for human beings, all this is terribly vague. And now, hey, someone might point at me and say, gosh, you're a Christian pastor. You guys major in vague. You talk about, all these ancient stories and these ideas and goodness and virtue and all of this stuff. I mean, Christians pointing at these guys being vague? That's the pot calling the kettle black.
I think it's been nothing short of amazing, the level of dedication that a lot of people have embraced these concepts with.
I think that's true. A lot of people are very excited, and they're listening, and they're eating it up.
It was very weird, of course. The Apple Podcast showed this as being, the Portal as being the #1 show in the world according to their charts, when we didn't even have a single episode out, showing that their algorithm was...
I don't know about that number. I mean, Joe Rogan, bigger than Joe Rogan? Kind of doubt that.
Of course, weirdly gameable. Because it shouldn't have recorded that a podcast with no shows was dominant. So that was very fun and amusing. Yeah, if you want to measure it by standard metrics of success, it's been a good ride, but that's not really how we want to measure it. I think what we want to measure it by is, can we take culture to a different level that is more rooted in reason, comity, accommodation, tolerance, love, creativity, soul, transcendence, than simply tearing each other down for fun and profit.
I like the list, but it's awfully preacherly, frankly, and in my mind, fairly Christian. Eric is, I think, one of the better institutional thinkers of the IDW bunch, and those of you who've listened to me for a while know part of the reason I started as a pastor making videos and started talking to people and doing what I've done over the last 2.5 years is because as a pastor, I know, now I can't compare myself to Jordan Peterson. I'm not as inspirational a speaker based on the metrics of what you see. But I know that someone hears a video or someone hears a sermon, and they're just flooded with emotions, and the world looks different, or maybe they're drawn down to tears and their heart is broken. And again, this is all the staple of churches. I mean, churches deal with this. Even a Christian Reformed church, which is fairly frozen chosen-y. This is what we deal with. But as a pastor, I know the flood of enthusiasm in a moment does not necessarily a changed life make. And so I saw this huge surge of response to Jordan Peterson, and I thought, where do these people go? That's why we started a meetup. That's why we started a Discord server. That's why I have conversations. That's why, and of course, I've got a day job in a little church, and so I can't be the pastor to all these people. But I wanted to start, one of the things I knew as a pastor is that what you have to do is build structures, and you have to build institutions, and you have to, people need a place to go where there are other people. Celebrity institutions, celebrities have their place in terms of mobilizing the moment and getting attention and drawing attention to something, but real life change happens day by day, decision by decision, relationship by relationship. And again, I think Eric, of the whole IDW bunch, I hear him talk about institutions more than just about anyone. And Brett was a teacher, and schools are one of those. Schools are institutions downstream of churches in many ways, at least our contemporary schools. But the images I get here from Eric and I hear from celebrities, to me, bring up kind of an image of a Dr. Seuss factory of pumping good up into the atmosphere. And they think we pastors are being vague. And, I appreciated the Plan B video that David did. That was interesting, too. But from where I sit, I see millions of churches, or I don't know how many churches there are in the world, hundreds of thousands of churches. And again, they're a catastrophe. I mean, you won't get me. They're a catastrophe, okay? Every church is, to one degree or another, including my own, dramatically unsuccessful in many ways. Dying on the vine. I don't know if my church is going to get through COVID or not. What happens to my channel if my church doesn't get through COVID? I don't know. Maybe I'll talk about that more. I think we're going to get a church app. And so for me, I actually had a conversation yesterday with some of the leaders in the church. I said, if we don't get through COVID, I mean, if I don't say so myself, I'm an above average preacher who could more than likely get another pulpit somewhere in the denomination and have another 15, 20 years of my career out there. What I think about are you people who listen to my videos, because I continue to get emails and notes on Twitter and comments and people in the Discord server that tell me that what I'm doing is important to them and helpful for them, and it helps make their life better. And so I struggle to figure out how to institutionalize this aspect, especially because I don't want to be a celebrity Christian or a celebrity pastor that just deals with people over cyber communication. One of the things I believe in is that I need a community around me that I am accountable to in one way or another in face-to-face relationships, because that's how people really are. Where am I going to my next slide? And so I listened to these two guys, and again, I mean, I'm a fan. I love listening. Gosh, how many hours have I listened to these two critters? And they're pumping out more stuff than I have time to listen to. But captains of the future? Now, I don't want to fail to appreciate thought leaders and the role that they play in history. Today, we continue to talk about Nietzsche or Kant or Hegel, philosophers that most people haven't read, or Marx, or on and on and on. But those lists are tiny. And right now there are thousands and thousands of philosophers and economists and writers, and what's going to happen in the age of decay is that the vast majority of their stuff is just not going to be remembered. And so I listen to these guys, and these guys are anxious. They've taken their data and they've got really compelling points. I was struck, however, when I mentioned that I watched a little bit of that Scott Adams video where Adams had a point too when he said, well, the lights are still on, the water's still on. Now these guys are saying this stuff is fragile, and point taken. On the other hand, Many, many, many people are going about their lives. I was struck at the beginning of the COVID epidemic who took it seriously and who didn't. Usually people who were paying attention to the news. But at the same time, when I'm looking at people who are paying a lot of attention to news or social media, but their levels of anxiety are higher. It would be interesting to correlate suicide and social media. My guess would be it'd be a fairly high correlation. Or news consumption and social media. A life experienced by an individual as one conscious little center of the universe is not a thing easily summed up and placed on a chart. So if you listen to these two talk, there's so much anxiety, lots of talk about. I mean, they can really sound like elitists sometimes, and I don't think they are. They're elitist populists, and in some ways they're aspiring oligarchs but they want to do very well on behalf of the masses, and they've got a heart for people who are struggling and not doing well economically. And so again, they're an interesting mix, and that's part of what's fun to listen to them. But again, it's as if general intelligence in human beings will save us. I mean, Eric says something almost that just that set often. And then we're back to data sets. And I think, really? And then, of course, you look at the Weinsteins versus Pinker. And Pinker, I haven't heard a lot from Steven Pinker lately. We're doing great! Humanity's doing wonderful! Up we go! All this hand-wringing, bah! Here, with these two, you've got the masters of hand-wringing. And you've got Steven Pinker saying, bah! Everything's going in the right direction. Well, again, I'd be curious if Steven Pinker continues to believe that. And then you just zip over to the world population and, okay, births today, almost 270,000. Deaths today, 113,000. That's in the middle of a global pandemic. Population growth today, 156,000. Man, Steven Pinker, point taken. We certainly are pumping more people into the world. Is that a source of anxiety or a source of celebration? Each of these people suffers. The United States is 5% of the population of the world. Many of these people coming onto the planet are not living like you or I with an internet connection and a computer. And I have this lovely fan blowing air on me right now, and I have a cool drink with ice in it. You know, I lived long enough in the third world to value ice and clean drinking water and. So population growth this year, 40 million people. Now, Eric and Brett's podcasts have done very well, but even if they get into PewDiePie range, PewDiePie has, 20-some million subscribers? 40 million people have joined the planet this year. Now, with all due respect, a nuclear exchange, or a global pandemic, or a global famine, or another world war. How many people died in the Second World War? Well, many more obviously would die in a similar conflict today, but 40 million people were added to the planet this year. What does that mean? I have no idea. Lots of little centers of the universe. And one of the things that I've noticed is that in the current imaginary, kind of in this secularized, secular humanist space, the summum bonum, the greatest good, is that all of these different individuals will have a good time in the world and experience meaning and joy and pleasure in their trip from 0 to 50 or 0 to 60 or 0 to 80 or 0 to 100, or maybe if Kurzweil gets his way even longer than that. That's how we assess things are good? That's how we know? Boy. Awfully vague. Yet these are the conversations we're immersing ourselves in. These are the conversations we care about. These are the things that our hearts are bleeding for. And I just think, are we in touch with much more than someone sitting watching well, maybe that's us watching YouTube and Netflix all the time, or in Brave New World laying back with just the right dosage of soma so that everything is lovely. Or the homeless people I deal with, who are one guy who basically has two modes, doing crack and sleeping. That's his life right now. That's his life right now. Another guy, trying to keep just that right amount of alcohol in his system, try and make it through to the end of the month so that he can somehow keep, pot, alcohol, maybe a little bit of stronger stuff every now and then, but just get in day to day. Or times nearly 8 billion people. But we're summing this up, we little masters of the universe. What is it exactly we are trying to save? Here, let's splash paint onto statues of George Washington as a statement against that he was a slave owner? Okay. But again, with Brett and Eric, I hear, well, we have to save the world. Why? What exactly is it that you're attempting to perpetuate? Where is the value? And again, Sevilla's channel and her project, value. Yeah, where is that value? You won't find value in the scientific frame. You'll find value in the manifest image, but we've got nearly 8 little billion carriers of value running around this world. And part of the reason there's so much conflict and strife is we can't agree. And then, of course, the New York Post says, vandals splashed paint on George Washington. And one of the first people on Twitter, vandals were a barbarian Germanic tribe. I love Twitter for that. Twitter should be for fun. A little earnest now and then, but, But I've been, working on something where I'm thinking about Rome and exactly what was Rome? What was that identity? What was that principality? Because, of course, after a certain point, descendants of that Italian peninsula were coming in, and you had emperors of the Roman Empire, and eventually you had the Holy Roman Empire, which many historians have said was not any of the three. They weren't holy, they weren't Roman, and they weren't an empire. But everyone wanted to be Roman. And even today, look at this statue of George Washington. Go to Washington, D.C. We take our cues from Rome and Egypt and the great empires, and we construct within our head this narrative, this imaginary in which somehow it means a lot to us to be heirs of this, and we want this to go on because I don't know any other word that actually captures this idea than religious or a narrative. I think you have to call it religious speech. Religion is the JPEG of being. It's how we sum it up. It's how we see value. It's how we measure value. Brett sees movement in his conversation with David, and I think that's exactly right. The religion as boogeyman is passing away. Should Christians cheer? Well, I don't know. People have always been incurably religious. The most productive aspects are the one that we're grown the capacity to relate more productively to one another. And if you look at the end of Eric's little speech right there, yeah, I agree with it. Sound like a lot of Christian values. And in almost every case, human well-being and meaning usually involves love, which is pretty darn close to sacrifice. Not being love, not necessarily the experience of romantic love, but Jordan Peterson, meaning carrying that, dragging that cross up that hill to the city of God, as Jordan likes to say, as he corrected me at the end of that David Fuller interview a couple of years ago. Isn't that what we care about? Isn't keeping that on the top of our value hierarchy what we mean? And then we have to ask the question, how can we inspire more and more of these 78 billion co-inhabitants of this planet to do so? Glenn Lowry's been in a lot of videos lately, and I had 3 cheers for that. I every time I listen to Glenn Lowry, my esteem for him grows. Excellent again, all the good stuff you people send me. I can't watch it all, but this conversation with reason, I get a lot of it from the Discord server. The Discord server has some lists of videos. I'm always scrolling down there, finding new things and that's that's the beauty of a community. The people in the Discord server tend to listen to my videos, and I read them, and together we form this strange community. And I'm trying to figure out how to strengthen that community. So every Friday from 10 to 12 Sacramento time, we're there with gathering people, and I give these long, crazy, unwieldy answers. And last Saturday, after I stopped the recording, I'll post the recording sometime this week, but are my answers too long? Yes and no. Shall we change the format? No, I like it the way it is. Yeah, let's try something new. And we'll continue to experiment. And for me, this is the joy of this whole project for me. You all are the joy of this project for me. And, I just went over 14,000 subscribers, which, I started about the same time as the whole rest of this pack in many ways, as Brett and Eric and Rebel Wisdom and Jonathan Peugeot, and they're all up into 6 figures, and little old me down in 14. But, even at the 14, most videos get 2,000-3,000 views, maybe 1,000. And of course, a little part of me says, whoa, it's too small, it's insignificant, I'm not important, I'm trying to evaluate it. But then I have conversations with you all, and I talk to you, and I'm the pastor of a small church. And, when I say to my small church, I want to figure out how we can keep this thing going because you're my friends. A number of years ago, I had a real opportunity to go to a much larger church. And I decided not to. And I looked around at all the people in their 60s and 70s then and thought, if I stay here, I'm going to bury my friends. And I've been burying my friends. And on one hand, it's always sad to see my friends go. On the other hand, I do good eulogies. And I want to make sure when we have that little gathering, when they're leaving this world, that someone who knew them and valued them and loved them and saw their glory speaks their glory to the community, and we will celebrate them because they had value. They were worth it. And again, I believe they're better, they're happier than I am now. So, I got off on a tangent. So I'm thrilled to see more Glenn Lowry out there, and this great interview. I watched him. I thought, boy, he knows how to do a conversation. I'm really crappy at it. That's why. See, I got hardly any people in my church because I'm a lousy pastor, and I don't have a lot of people on my YouTube channel because I'm a lousy YouTuber. In fact, a friend told me, we got to improve the quality of your YouTubes, Paul. You'd have more subscribers. And I thought, yeah, probably would, but is it laziness or sloth or... I don't mind just having a few thousand people. That's a lot for someone to interact with. And when I get an email from someone who says they're struggling in their marriage or they're depressed or they, and I want to talk to them because I want to make it better. Most of the time I can't. So I had this conversation with Glenn, and that was one of the best conversations with Glenn. Got Glenn to open up a bit about part of what's really cool about Glenn's story, and you can find it in his conversation with Tom Wright on meaningoflife.tv, where Glenn talks about his life, where Glenn, obviously a brilliant man, rising fast through the ranks of academia, got into some trouble with drugs, went to a black church, got saved, got off drugs, got his life on track, was able to fix his marriage, and then had an assistant who was young, just blossoming, and she died of cancer. And the celebration at the church, kind of a Pentecostal church, it was a celebration, not so much of her life, but, and I don't do those kinds of funerals, but I've seen them done where, well, she's much better off, and so no sadness here. And I don't think that's the way to do a funeral, frankly. But Glenn just couldn't believe that Jesus was alive or she was alive, and the tragedy of her death just he couldn't believe anymore. And so he left, Chuck Colson's prison fellowship. And so, when I listen to Glenn Lowry talk, I've got a lot of esteem for him, even though I do believe there's a mournful quality in his loss of faith that I respect. And if he talks to me, I'll lend him some of my faith too, just like Voth. But I'm going down rabbit trails. But in this conversation, the guy from Reason TV.tv or the Reason channel, I guess they're libertarians, I don't know, pressed him on, well, what's the application? What, we can complain about the leaders that have failed the black community, but what needs to happen? And Lowry quite honestly kind of said, I don't know. These are hard problems. Is it midnight basketball? Is it mentorship? Is it boys and girls clubs? Is it what is it? And he notes quite rightly that part of what needs to happen is that we need to do what we can to help black youth start to succeed in this world. And when, again, succeed is another terribly fudgy, vague term but you can sort of measure it. Do better in school. Fewer out-of-wedlock pregnancies. And now I sound like some arch-conservative, but that's part of, voted for Obama twice. Yeah, go ahead, leave the comments. But at the same time, as a pastor, I see the stories in high resolution with personal names and faces, and I look at the generations of failure, and I look at the struggles, and I look at the traps and the pitfalls. And yeah, one person at a time. And how many times haven't I done what I could for this one person and it fails? And if you want to read stories of that, read my father's book. Story after story after story. Some people doing better, some people doing worse. Again, how to measure this stuff, hard to say, but in some ways, again, moving off of Chesterton's Heretics, chapter 2, where we can't say the good, but we sure can, as Jordan Peterson says, I don't know how to make it better, but making it worse sure seems obvious and easy. And one of the things that you see right away is the role of mediating institutions. Government is just too high, even down to the city level. And again from city people, because I'm a pastor, but I'm a pastor of an insignificant church. But the city's always paying attention to pastors. Why? Not because they're just looking for votes, because they understand that you need all these other mediating institutions all the way down, and you need and institutions that network individuals with other individuals, with resources, with good leaders, with good ideas, with accountability, with encouragement. And that is, families and churches and clubs and schools and communities. All these mediating institutions are essential. And de Tocqueville saw this, and of course Robert Putnam with Bowling Alone said, this is what's eroding from us. And even though I don't hear almost anyone in the IDW space talking about it, that's one of many measures of the failures of our societies, that we've lost these institutions. Now, again, in all fairness, Brett's on Brett and Jordan Peterson are talking about schools, and schools are one of those institutions. Schools are one of those institutions where where it gets down to face-to-face relationships, and they're sticky, and they have accountability, and they have importance, and it's not something you can just walk away from without feeling a sense of loss of meaning. And it's exactly those institutions, if families, schools, churches, clubs, communities, all of these things, these are in many ways, these are the relationships that help us become who we need to be, and these relationships equip people to stand in there and do what? To become police officers and serve in the army and organize for protests and make a meal for someone in trouble. Because I remember as a kid watching this movie in Christian school, Cipher in the Snow, it was called. It was about this little boy who got off a school bus and dropped dead in the snow. And thinking back on it now, it was the meaning crisis. Nobody loved this kid. We have the stories from the beds in Romania. Yeah, you give them food, but you don't touch them. And these people have tremendous struggles they have to overcome for the rest of their lives. These mediating institutions are so foundational. You know, we can keep putting videos out there into the world that 100,000 or maybe 1 million people see, but the real power is in these mediating institutions. And, you know, the atheists and all their, quite frankly, atheism is in real trouble. Atheism's in more trouble than the church, quite frankly. New atheism is dead. It died in the protests this year. It was on its last legs going into it. But, you know, Sam Harris is doing mushrooms and making a meditation app. You don't think atheism is dead? Well, there you have it. But it's these mediating institutions where it's not just good ideas and floating in my head, but face to face with someone. And then at some point, someone will say, what's going on in your relationship? What's going on as a father or as a mother? What's going on in the spaces that count in your life that touch other real people? It's between us that all of the important work happens. The rise of the nuns, not N-U-N-S, but N-O-N-E-S, is in many ways a disaster. Just on this front, the degree to which a cultivated governing story has declined in being applied to the lives of the individuals in community. Well, you know, if you can camp okay on metaphorical truth, communities suss out these metaphorical truths, and yeah, you know, again, you're not going to get me saying that churches and pastors aren't full of malarkey. They just are. There's so much dysfunction and so much stuff going on, but sending everybody home with a stimulus check and a Netflix account is not going to make the world better. What does it come down to so often? And looking at Eric's little list there, so often in ministry, I tell people what it comes down to is the question, can you endure suffering and sacrifice for the people around you? And boy, even just saying that, the meaning starts to go up. Can you listen to the person that is insufferable and not just walk away? Can you stick in there with a marriage that is difficult? Will you continue to figure out how to love the child well? And that doesn't mean coddling or enabling. It means figuring out that tremendously difficult mix that you most often get wrong of waiting to say the right thing. Do you cut and run? Do you hide in a selfish hole? Do you withdraw into fantasy or withdrawal or drugs or alcohol or? Or do you just divorce and leave and run away and try and start again, and you leave a trail of broken marriages behind you? And when you get into your 50s and the doctor gave you those pills to help with your hurt knees, do you just take more and more and more and then hopefully just slide off into some soma death because, well, it's painful, so out I go? In many ways, that's what it comes down to. And again, To me, no, it's no mystery why one of the world's most successful religions has on the wall of almost every church a cross. Do you stay on that cross? Where Marker said he's calling to Elijah. If you're the Son of God, come down from that cross and smite us. Ha ha, you never will. It wasn't because he didn't want to. It was because he knew he would do it for them. That's at the center of this religion. And it's not a bad thing to have centered for a community of people. Because again and again and again, when I talk to people about their mundane, common, secular lives, how often doesn't it boil down to, can you hold your tongue for the sake of the other? Can you sacrifice? Can you put their welfare ahead of your own? Can you live out your well-being at my expense? Oh, there's a ton of meaning in it, but it's so hard, and we're really bad at it, and we fail at it, which is why these mediating institutions and what is required to stay in them are so foundational. If you figure out how to stay in a marriage, you'll probably do better staying in a church. You'll probably do better staying in relationship with your kid. You'll probably do better staying in relationship with your neighborhood association or your little do-gooding benevolence club or even just your small circle of friends. You'll show up for one another. You'll bring a casserole. You'll go to the funeral. You'll lend them $20. That web creates the world and addresses human well-being. And the saddest stories possible are the one who are people who are isolated. The degree to which the masses of a culture can do these things, you'll see change in the numbers. But this capacity itself, and I know others have tried it, hardiness and some of these other studies, in many ways, that's what it takes. Can you love your neighbor? I'm dropping a little slide from the sermon series that I'm working on. Jesus, the segment of the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus deals with the law and in many ways ups the stakes and says, my followers, not even anger, not even lust, not divorcing, non-defensiveness, non-retaliatory. So often I watch people just exploding their relationships. Why? Because their feelings got hurt. Of course your feelings got hurt because their ego got damaged. They want to lash out. They want to be defensive. And again, I think David Fuller often says following, I lost track of that guy. Found him on Twitter at some point. The thing about the IDW is that it's the way that we're talking to each other. And one of the real benefits of the IDW is can we have conversations across differences that are productive? It's John Vervaeke's Dialogos. And you know what? Even if my other conversations are skeptical about Christianity, I'll have a good faith conversation with Sam Harris in a heartbeat. What do I mean? Let's see if we can leave the conversation better than what we went into it. What does it come down to? Loving your enemy. Now in Christianity, we have practices that we do these things. Giving away your money. Prayer and fasting. Now those are very religious-y terms. What is fasting? Fasting is in many ways self-denial of the basic needs of life. Gluttony, lust, these kinds of things. What is prayer? Well, y'all are going to translate that lots of different ways. Go for it. Meditation, it's stopping, it's figuring out how the center of you connects with the center of being and to practice that. Now in Christianity, of course, how do you do it? Well, then he leads right into the Lord's Prayer. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. I am small, you are great. I don't matter, you matter. I'm not the little center of the universe. Again, in many ways, the secularism of Brett and Eric is Humanity must be preserved. In some ways, that's their devotion to God, in a way. I think it's a reduction, but in a strange way, that's how thy king, that's how that's measured. And then thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. May my children have a better life than I am. Give us this day my daily bread. I have needs. Meet my needs. And forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into the time of testing, but deliver us from evil, or the evil one. And there's a reason my channel is small. My videos are ranty. They're unorganized. There's unorganized as my head. There's a little buzz when the computer goes on, and I never have the sound set up. And so my friend Rick wants to build me a little studio. We'll see if I use it, because if enough of you write me back and say, Paul, you've helped me, I'd probably keep doing this. But in my opinion, if you want to be a world saver, look around you. Love the one you're with. Figure out how to be that good parent. Figure out how to be that good citizen. Figure out how to, and again, there'll be lots of talk and lots of chatter and lots of culture stuff, and all that is important. That's all fine. But love your neighbor as yourself. Love the Lord your God. And again, I can spin that all sorts of ways. And love your neighbor as yourself. There's the whole law right in those two things.